Good morning. I was thinking about the Talmud, and so you have the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the Pentateuch. Well, the Talmud is a oral commentary over the first 5 books of the Bible. And where the Talmud came from is in about 600 AD. Check that, make sure that's accurate. They could never write down their Halakhah, and the Halakhah was the oral commentary. And they also had the Haggadah, which was the written commentary. Now the oral commentary couldn't be spoken out loud, and the Haggadah couldn't be the Halakhah couldn't be written down because it was the oral commentary, and the Haggadah, which was written down, couldn't be spoken out loud. So eventually those became tied into something called the Midrash. And then the Midrash was turned into, which was a combination of the Halakhah and the Haggadah, eventually became these volumes called the Mishnah. And there's like 6 volumes of the Mishnah, I believe, in the Babylonian Talmud. But there was a Talmud that the Babylonians had, and then there was a Talmud that the Palestinian Jews had. Now, fact check all of this, because it's a lot of information to put in order, and it takes a lot of reading and a lot of studying to even learn what these different things are. Like the Gemara was the aramaic commentaries that were added to the different commentaries that already existed. So when I guess they had started speaking Aramaic instead of Hebrew, so they put their little commentaries in a new language. Like I said, I can't remember it all right off, and eventually I'd like to get around to reading this information directly from sources. But this was just on my mind this morning, and I thought y'all might find it interesting. So remember the oral law is the Halakhah. Remember the Haggadah was the written that couldn't be spoken out loud. So Halakhah, Haggadah, and those eventually became the Midrash, and the Midrash was turned into the Mishnah, and then the Mishnah became the Talmud. So fact check all of that, remember those words at least, so then you'll have a good idea of what you can be studying to kind of learn a little more. And that's why I recommended before Alfred Edersheim and John Lightfoot, because those 2 guys will explain to you a lot about this. And all of that stuff is what the synagogue invented, and the synagogue was not a holy thing. The synagogue is an unholy thing. So every time we find Paul going to speak at the synagogue, they're the ones who are throwing him out and beating him and all of those kind of things that Christians will suffer, if not physically like Paul, at least spiritually, because we'll tell people you can't change God's rules. And that's exactly what all of those words I just mentioned were doing, was they were changing God's law. And that's why Jesus was speaking against them, was for those changes they had made. In previous videos, I had mentioned a guy named Alfred Edersheim. and I wanted to read to you some excerpts from his books, The Life and Time of Jesus the Messiah. I had a video called Halakhah Haggadah Midrash Mishnah Talmud, and I would like to just read this to you so you can get an idea of what some of that is. It says, this body of traditional ordinances forms the subject of the Mishnah, or second repeated law. We have here to place on one side the law of Moses as recorded in the Pentateuch as standing by itself. All else, even the teaching of the prophets and of the hagiographa, as well as the oral traditions, bore the general name of Kabbalah, that which has been received. The sacred study, or Midrash, in the original application of the term, concerned either the Halakhah, traditional ordinance, which was always that which had been heard, Shematha, or else the Haggadah, that which was said upon the authority of the individuals, not as legal ordinance. So that was just explaining to you what Midrash is. You had heard me say before, Halakhah and Haggadah make up the Midrash. Halakhah is the oral law. Haggadah is that which was said upon the authority of the individual, not as legal ordinance. But remember, the Haggadah couldn't be spoken out loud. It was illustration, commentary, anecdote, clever or learned sayings, etc. At first, the Halakhah remained unwritten, probably owing to the disputes between Pharisees and Sadducees. So there you go. Halakhah couldn't be written down. It was to be spoken orally. But the necessity of fixedness and order led in course of time to more or less complete collections of the Halakhah. The oldest of these is ascribed to Aqaba in the time of the Emperor Hadrian, but the authoritative collection in the so-called Mishnah is the work of Jehuda the Holy, who died about the end of the 2nd century of our era. Altogether, the Mishnah comprises 6 orders, Sederim. So the Mishnah comprises 6 orders. I had said earlier that the Talmud was made of those, so let's see if it goes on to say it. Each devoted to a special class of subjects. These orders are divided into tractates, Masiktoth, textures or webs, of which there are 63 or else 62 in all. These tractates are again subdivided into chapters, Parakim, in all 525, which severally consist of a certain number of verses, or Mishnahs, mishnaic, in all 187. Considering the variety and complexity of the subjects treated, the Mishnah is arranged with remarkable logical perspicuity. The language in Hebrew, though of course not that of the Old Testament, the words rendered necessary by the new circumstances are chiefly derived from the Greek, the Syriac, and the Latin, with Hebrew terminations, but all connected with social intercourse or ordinary life, such as contracts, is written not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, as the language of the people. But the traditional law embodied other materials than the Halakhah collected in the Mishnah. Some that had not been recorded there found a place in the works of certain rabbis, or were derived from their schools. These are called Baraithas, that is, traditional external to the Mishnah. Finally, there were additions, or Toseftoth, dating after the completion of the Mishnah, but probably not later than the 3rd century of our era. Such there are not fewer than 52 out of the 63 mishnaic tractates. When speaking of the Halakhah as distinguished from the Haggadah, we must not, however, suppose that the later could be entirely separated from it. In point of fact, one whole tractate in the Mishnah about the sayings of the fathers is entirely Haggadah. A second, Midoth, the measurements of the temple, has Halakhah in only 14 places, while in the rest of the tractates Haggadah occurs in not fewer than 207 places. Only 13 out of the 63 tractates, or the Mishnah, are entirely from the Haggadah. This is the rest of the video for the Alfred Edersheim. Hitherto we have only spoken of the Mishnah, but this comprises only a very small part of traditionalism. In the course of the time, the discussions, illustrations, explanations, and additions to which the Mishnah gave rise, whether in its application or in the academies of the rabbis, were authoritatively collected and edited in what are known as the two Talmuds, or Gemaras. I had mentioned that there's two. If we imagine something combining law reports, a rabbinical Hansard, and notes of a theological debating club, all thoroughly Oriental, which means Eastern, full of digressions, anecdotes, quaint sayings, fancies, legends, and too often of what from its profanity, superstition, and even obscenity could scarcely be quoted, we may form some general idea of what the Talmud is, or another word would be ridiculous. He doesn't say it here. The oldest of these two Talmuds dates from about the close of the 4th century of our era. It is the product of the Palestinian academies, and hence called the Jerusalem Talmud. The second is about a century younger, and the outcome of the Babylonian schools, hence called the Babylon, afterwards also our Talmud, so the Babylon Talmud. We do not possess either of these works complete. The most defective is the Jerusalem Talmud, which is also much briefer and contains far fewer discussions than that of Babylon. The Babylon Talmud, which in its present form extends over 36 out of the 63 tractates of the Mishnah, is about 10 or 11 times the size of the latter and more than 4 times that of the Jerusalem Talmud. It occupies, in our editions, with marginal commentations, 2,947 folio leaves, pages A and B. Both Talmuds are written in Armenian, the one in its western, the other in its eastern dialect, and in both the Mishnahs discuss seriatim and clause by clause. Of the character of these discussions, it would be impossible to convey an adequate idea when we bear in mind the many sparkling, beautiful, and occasionally also sublime passages in the Talmud, but especially that its form of thought and expression so often recall those of the New Testament. Only prejudice and hatred could indulge in indiscriminate vituperation. On the other hand, it seems unaccountable how anyone who has read a Talmudic tractate, or even part of one, could compare the Talmud with the New Testament, or find in the one the origin of the other. So, I thought y'all might find that interesting, just for the history, some of the history, or even just what the Talmud is. You have to remember the Talmud is just ridiculous. It really has a bunch of opinions, and Jesus was completely 100% against the rabbinical writings, because the rabbinical writings come out of the synagogue, and the synagogue never had God's blessing. The temple is the only thing you'll find in the Old Testament that God actually said, you're going to do this, and it wasn't even questionable. But the synagogue came out of when the Jews went into the diaspora, which was when the Assyrians and the Babylonians carried them off. They went over there and started their little synagogue, kumbaya, and it was bad. It was all bad. So, okay, I'm sorry, it wasn't all bad. You know, certainly there's some truth in there somewhere, you know. It's just that it certainly wasn't it wasn't anything that was supposed to be going on, like the reading of the inspired Word of God. So I hope y'all enjoyed that. Have a nice day.